August 7, 1942. Private First Class Robert Bob Miller clutched the cold steel of his M1918 pack howitzer as a Higgins boat slammed against the unruly surf of the Solomon Islands. Around him, the air smelled of salt spray, diesel exhaust, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. To the world, this was the opening gambit of the Guadalcanal campaign, the first major offensive of the Allied powers against the Empire of Japan. But for Miller and the men of the 11th Marine Regiment, it was the moment their theoretical training met the brutal reality of jungle warfare. The global stakes were suffocating. The Japanese had been carving through the Pacific with terrifying efficiency, and should they complete the airfield on this mosquito-infested strip of land, the supply lines between the United States and Australia would be severed. The mission was simple in its command but impossible in its geography. Take the beach, hold the ridge, and stop the tide of the rising sun. As the ramp dropped, the Marines didn't just carry rifles. They hauled the heavy, disassembled components of their artillery pieces through waist-deep water and onto the shifting sands of Red Beach. In the early 20th century, the Marine Corps was often viewed as a light colonial infantry, but the High Command realized that without the king of battle, the infantry would be slaughtered in the dense canopy of the Pacific. The heat was immediate, a physical weight that pressed down on the men as they labored to move tons of steel into the treeline. There was an eerie silence on the shore. The Japanese defenders had retreated into the interior, but every veteran knew this was the breath before the scream. Miller wiped the sweat from his eyes, his hands trembling slightly as he tightened the bolts on a 75mm pack howitzer. He knew that when the sun set, the jungle would come alive, and the only thing standing between his brothers and the bayonets of the Imperial Japanese Army would be the calculated trajectory of a high-explosive shell. The Crucible of the Tenaru. August 21st, 1942. The silence of the Guadalcanal night was shattered not by a whistle, but by a roar. Colonel Kaineo Ichiki's elite infantry, fueled by a belief in their own invincibility, charged across the sandspit at the mouth of the Ilu River. They moved like a ghost wave, bayonets glinting under the pale moonlight, screaming banzai, as they threw themselves at the thin line of the 1st Marine Division. This was the Battle of the Tenaru, and for the young men in the foxholes, the world had narrowed down to the flickering muzzle flashes of their own rifles. Behind the front lines, the men of the 11th Marines received the urgent coordinates through crackling field phones. There was no time for deliberation. The order was fire mission, and within seconds, the jungle floor shook. The 75mm and 105mm howitzers, painstakingly positioned days earlier, began to belch fire. This wasn't the distant, theoretical support of a naval bombardment. This was danger-close artillery. The shells screamed mere feet over the heads of the cowering Marine infantry, exploding in the dense mass of the Japanese charge. The carnage was absolute. The Japanese doctrine emphasized the spirit of the warrior over the cold mathematics of firepower, but on the banks of the Tenaru, the spirit met the splintering steel of American high explosives. Each burst sent shards of jagged metal through the air, siding down the charging ranks before they could ever reach the marine wire. Colonel Ichiki watched from a treeline as his regiment, one of the finest in the Imperial Army, was systematically dismantled by a force they had underestimated. By dawn, the sandspit was a graveyard of broken equipment and shattered lives. The victory at the Tenaru proved to the world that the Japanese were not invincible, but it also cemented a new reality for the Marine Corps. The jungle was a meat grinder, and the only way to survive it was through the overwhelming, coordinated application of fire. As the smoke cleared and the Marines surveyed the hundreds of fallen enemies, they realized the war in the Pacific had changed. It would no longer be a series of skirmishes, but an industrial-scale war of attrition where the big guns would decide who held the ground. The Steel Rain of Bloody Ridge. September 12, 1942. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Edson looked out over the jagged limestone spine that would soon be immortalized as Bloody Ridge. His raiders and par Marines were exhausted, their faces hollowed out by malaria and hunger. Below them, in the dark shadows of the jungle, General Kyote Kawaguchi was massing over 3,000 men for a final, desperate push to retake Henderson Field. Edson knew his men couldn't hold the line with small arms alone. He picked up the radio and contacted the artillery controllers of the 11th Marines. His message was grim. "We need everything you've got." The Japanese began their assault under the cover of a moonless sky, moving to the tall Kenai grass like predators. They struck with a violence that nearly broke the Marine center. As the perimeter began to buckle, the Marine howitzers situated near the airfield opened up. This was no longer just support. It was a wall of steel. The artillerymen worked like machines, stripping to the waist in the humid night, slamming shells into breeches until the paint on the gun barrels began to blister and peel. The coordination was a masterpiece of lethal geometry. Forward observers, stationed just yards away from the screaming Japanese bayonet charges, called for fire on their own positions as a last resort. The shells landed so close that the concussion knocked the wind out of the defending Marines. But the effect on the Japanese was devastating. The ridge became a vortex of fire and earth. Kawaguchi's elite battalions were being shredded by a constant, rhythmic steel rain that denied them any cover. By the time the sun rose over the smoking slopes of the ridge, the Japanese offensive had collapsed into a disorganized retreat. Over 800 Japanese bodies lay scattered across the slopes, the vast majority victims of the relentless shelling. The 11th Marines had fired nearly 2,000 rounds in a single night, a staggering expenditure that saved the airfield and, arguably, the entire campaign. But as the gunners leaned against their overheating weapons, they knew the cost. The Pacific War was evolving. The Japanese were learning to dig deeper, and the Marines would soon need even heavier steel to root them out. The heavy hammer of Tarawa. November 20th, 1943. General Julian Smith stood on the bridge of the USS Maryland, squinting to the haze of cordite and salt spray at a tiny speck in the Gilbert Islands, BDO. This was the heart of the Tarawa Atoll, a fortress bristling with coastal defense guns and reinforced concrete bunkers. Unlike the muddy jungles of Guadalcanal, Tarawa was a coral cage. The Japanese commander had boasted that 1,000,000 men could not take it in 100 years. As the first waves of the 2nd Marine Division climbed down the cargo nets into their LVT Amtraks, they were about to test a new doctrine of amphibious assault, one that relied on a marriage of naval gunfire and organic marine artillery. The plan was for a rolling barrage, a curtain of fire that would walk across the island ahead of the infantry. But as the boats hit the reef, the plan dissolved into chaos. The tide was lower than predicted. Hundreds of Marines were forced to disembark hundreds of yards from shore, wading through chest-deep water into a gale of machine gun fire. The naval bombardment had been thunderous, but it failed to crack the low-profile Japanese pillboxes. The infantry was being pinned down on a narrow strip of sand, their blood turning the turquoise lagoon a sickening crimson. In this moment of slaughter, the necessity of pack artillery became a matter of survival. Marine artillerymen, desperate to provide direct support, managed to manhandle their 75mm pack howitzers onto a narrow beachhead amidst the carnage. They weren't firing at distant coordinates now. They were leveling the barrels, firing point-blank at the embrasures of bunkers that were mowing down their brothers. One gun crew, led by Sergeant Steve Bonnet, dragged their weapon to the surf under intense sniper fire, losing half their men before they reached the seawall. They set up in the open, exposed to every rifleman on the island, and began systematically silencing the Japanese heavy machine guns. It was a brutal, intimate duel between concrete and steel. The lessons of Tarawa were written in the sand. Naval guns could soften a target, but to root out a hidden enemy, the Marines needed their own cannons on the ground, breathing down the neck of the infantry. The Cauldron of Saipan. June 15, 1944. The Mariana Islands represented the inner defense line of the Japanese Empire. If the Marines took Saipan, the new B-29 Superfortress bombers would be within striking distance of Tokyo. Recognizing this existential threat, the Japanese didn't just meet the Marines on the beach. They waited with a sophisticated, pre-registered network of their own artillery. As the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions struggled to establish a foothold, they found themselves trapped in a literal cauldron of fire. For the first time in the Pacific, the Marines weren't just the hunters. They were being hunted by heavy-caliber steel raining from the heights of Mount Tapachot. The situation on the beachhead was desperate. Japanese observers, perched in caves high above the landing zones, could see every movement, every landing craft, and every supply dump. They called down accurate, devastating fire that threatened to push the invasion back into the sea. The Marine response had to be swift and overwhelming. The 10th and 14th Marine Regiments performed a feat of logistical heroism, offloading their 105mm howitzers under a constant barrage. Within hours of landing, they began the grueling process of counter-battery fire, a lethal game of chess where the prize was survival. The duel was relentless. Marine gunners would fire, then immediately move their pieces to avoid the inevitable Japanese retaliatory strike. The heat was suffocating, and the grit of the volcanic soil got into everything: the breached blocks, the sights, and the open wounds of the wounded. But the Marines had a secret weapon, the Fire Direction Center, FDC. Using advanced mathematics and radio coordination, the Marines could now mass the fire of multiple batteries onto a single target. When a Japanese gun flashed on a mountainside, a dozen Marine howitzers would respond simultaneously, obliterating position in a single, thunderous, concentrated strike. This was the birth of modern Marine Corps artillery coordination. It was no longer about individual guns firing at targets they could see. It was an invisible, network system of destruction. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon on D-Day, the Marine artillery had fired over 15,000 rounds. They had successfully suppressed the Japanese heights, allowing the infantry to begin the bloody ascent of Mount Tapachot. The king of battle had saved the beachhead, but the cost was rising, and the Japanese were preparing a counterattack that would test the guns to their absolute breaking point. The Night of the Living Dead, July 7, 1944. The Japanese command on Saipan was broken, but their spirit was not. Facing total defeat, General Saito issued a final, chilling order. Every able-bodied man, and even the wounded, would participate in the Gyokusai, a massive final suicide charge. At 4 a.m., the largest banzai attack of the Pacific War erupted. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers, some armed only with bayonets lashed to bamboo poles, surged toward the lines of the 105th Infantry and the supporting Marine batteries. It was a wave of human desperation that threatened to wash over the American positions by sheer weight of numbers. The artillerymen of the 10th Marines suddenly found themselves on the front lines. The screaming mass of the enemy had bypassed the forward infantry and was now swarming into the gun pits. The order, set fuse to zero, echoed through the batteries. This was the artilleryman's nightmare. Firing muzzle bursts, where the shell explodes almost immediately upon leaving the barrel, turning the howitzer into a giant shotgun. Cannoneers who had spent the war calculating trajectories now drew their .45 pistols and carbines. They fought hand-to-hand in the mud to protect their pieces. One gun crew stayed with their howitzer even as the Japanese crawled over the sandbags, firing shells directly into the charging ranks at point-blank range. The flashes of the guns illuminated a scene of medieval carnage. The Marines were no longer just technicians of fire. They were infantrymen defending their steel gods. By dawn, the area in front of the batteries was a landscape of frozen violence. The big guns had held, but the barrels were choked with the debris of the struggle. The 105mm howitzers had fired hundreds of rounds at ranges so short they defied the manuals. This victory at Saipan came at a terrible price, but it proved a vital point. The Marine artilleryman was a dual threat, as capable with a bayonet as he was with a range table. The path to the Japanese home islands was now open, but the defenders were retreating into the caves of Iwo Jima, where even the heaviest shells would struggle to find them. February 19, 1945. General Tadamaki Kuribayashi had spent months turning the volcanic island of Iwo Jima into a subterranean fortress. He knew he couldn't stop the Marines on the beach, so he did something far more terrifying. He let them land. As the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions struggled through black, shifting volcanic ash, Kuribayashi waited until the beaches were choked with men and equipment. Then, from the eye of Mount Suribachi, he unleashed a coordinated hell. The Japanese didn't just fire, they vanished. Every time a Marine battery attempted to set up, they were targeted by hidden mortar pits and heavy artillery tucked deep inside reinforced caves. The 13th Marine Regiment faced a logistical nightmare. Their heavy howitzers sank to their axles in the soft soot. To get the guns into action, crews had to lay down Marston matting and literally manhandle the multi-ton weapons under a constant rain of Japanese steel. This was a war of sight and kill. Marine observers on the ground worked with grasshopper, spotting planes circling above to find the tiny puffs of smoke that betrayed a Japanese gun position. Once located, the response was a time-on-target strike, where multiple batteries timed their shots, so that every shell landed on the Japanese position at the exact same second. It was the only way to crack the reinforced concrete of the island. On Iwo Jima, the artillery didn't just support the infantry. It became their only shield against an invisible enemy that refused to die. April 1st, 1945, the final act of the Great Crusade in the Pacific took place on the island of Okinawa. This was the largest amphibious assault of the war, and for the Marine artillery, it was their Guadalcanal. On this island, the scale of violence reached its zenith. The 11th, 15th, and 22nd Marine Regiments were part of a massive Allied artillery park that turned the southern half of the island into a literal moonscape. Okinawa was a proving ground for the VT or proximity fuse, a radar-equipped shell that exploded in the air above the enemy, showering them with shrapnel. For the Japanese soldiers hiding in the trenches of the Shuri line, there was no longer any escape. The Marine artillery had become a perfected machine of destruction. They were now firing preparatory barrages that lasted for hours, consuming hundreds of thousands of rounds, turning ridges into dust before the first infantryman ever stepped off. When the news of the Japanese surrender finally reached the fleet in August 1945, the guns of the Marine Corps went silent for the first time in nearly 4 years. From the malaria-ridden swamps of Guadalcanal to the blackened caves of Okinawa, the Marine Corps artillery had transformed from a small auxiliary force into the most lethal tool in the American arsenal. They had proved that while the infantry might take the ground, it was the king of battle that held it. The legacy of these men lives on in every fire mission called today. They weren't just soldiers. They were the mathematicians of the battlefield, the men who turned the tide of history with the pull of a lanyard. As the smoke of the 20th century cleared, one truth remained. In the chaotic symphony of war, the last word is always spoken by the guns. Marine Corps artillery,